Dust rises in the heat of a desert wind. Hills roll across the horizon, dry and jagged, yet dotted with vineyards, olive groves, and shepherds guiding their flocks. Here, in the rugged land of Canaan, a people once carved their story into stone and scripture. Their names echo in prayers and hymns, but their footsteps have long since vanished into the silence of time. These were not empires of towering walls like Babylon, nor palaces dripping in gold like Egypt. They were tribes, bound by covenant, by faith, and by the dream of a promised land. From nomadic wanderers, they became a kingdom. From scattered families, they forged identity. But history is cruel. What begins in unity can fracture into rivalries. What is promised can be lost. And what disappears into exile can leave behind a mystery that haunts millennia. The lost tribes of Israel. 10 tribes, swallowed by conquest, erased from the map, their descendants debated and sought across continents. Did they perish? Did they blend into foreign lands? Or do their bloodlines flow silently through nations we would never suspect? Our story begins here, in the highlands of ancient Canaan, where the kingdom first took root. It was the 11th century BCE. The sun burned over the hills of Judea, and the valleys around the Jordan shimmered in summer haze. This land had already seen the march of Egyptians and the clash of Canaanite city-states, yet now a new people stood upon its soil, the Israelites. They were a confederation of tribes, loosely held together by shared traditions and their devotion to a single God. Their lives revolved around sacred altars and tribal assemblies, the echoes of nomadic wanderings still fresh in their memory. They had no mighty fortresses, no bronze-plated legions. Their strength was in their stories, tales of Abraham who left Ur, of Moses who defied Pharaoh, of Joshua who brought them across the Jordan. At first, they were ruled by judges, leaders who rose in moments of crisis. But as time passed, pressure from surrounding enemies grew unbearable. The Philistines on the coast, the Arameans to the north, Moabites and Ammonites pressing in from the east, every border carried danger. The Israelites demanded a king. And so, a monarchy was born. Saul, the first king, rose to lead them, though his reign was marred by instability. Yet his successor, David, transformed a fragile confederation into something resembling a true kingdom. From his citadel in Jerusalem, David forged alliances, defeated rivals, and carried the Ark of the Covenant to the heart of his city. For the first time, the tribes saw themselves not just as scattered kin, but as one people. Under Solomon, David's son, this fragile union blossomed into a golden age. In Jerusalem, stone rose against the sky. The temple, built of cedar from Lebanon and stone from the Judean hills, glittered in sunlight, a beacon for worship and a symbol of permanence. Trade caravans brought wealth, and alliances with Phoenicia and Egypt secured prosperity. But even in this golden glow, shadows crept in. Solomon's grandeur came at a cost. Heavy taxation, forced labor, and political marriages with foreign powers planted seeds of discontent. To some, the temple was glory. To others, it was a monument built on their sweat and sacrifice. The kingdom was young, and its unity fragile. Behind the songs of prosperity, murmurs of division began to stir. The tribes were not equal. The north, fertile and populous, felt overshadowed by Judah in the south. And so, the stage was set. A kingdom born in promise, but fragile in its foundation. A temple gleaming in the sun, but shadows gathering at its base. The land of Canaan had given them a kingdom, but whether it would endure was a question only history would answer. From the hills of unity, the story would descend into fracture. The Song of Solomon's temple still echoed in Jerusalem, but soon, the harmony would shatter. Brothers would turn against brothers, and a single kingdom would split into 2 rival thrones. The Temple of Solomon still gleamed beneath the sun, its courtyards thronged with pilgrims, its altars heavy with sacrifice. Yet beyond the golden facade, the air grew tense, restless, heavy with murmurs of discontent. The kingdom that David and Solomon had built stood at its height, but like a cedar split by hidden rot, its unity was already cracking. It was 931 BCE. Solomon was dead. His son, Rehoboam, ascended the throne. He inherited not only his father's wealth and glory, but also his burdens, a discontented people weary of taxation, weary of forced labor, weary of Jerusalem's dominance. When the tribes of the north gathered to crown him, they did not arrive with celebration, but with demands. "Lighten the yoke your father laid upon us," they pleaded. The moment was fragile, the future of the kingdom balanced on the young king's answer. Rehoboam sought counsel. The elders urged mercy, compromise, a gentler hand. But his younger advisors urged severity, show no weakness. Tighten the reins. Let them fear your rule. Rehoboam chose arrogance. His words fell like iron. "My father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will make it heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions." The answer was a spark in dry grass. The northern tribes erupted. 10 tribes declared rebellion, breaking their ties to the house of David. They crowned their own king, Jeroboam, a former official who had long opposed Solomon's rule. From that moment, the kingdom split in two. To the north, the kingdom of Israel, vast, fertile, and populous, its capital first at Shechem, then Tirzah, and later Samaria. To the south, the kingdom of Judah, smaller, poorer, but holding Jerusalem, the temple, and the Davidic throne. The division was not just political. It was spiritual. Jeroboam feared that pilgrimages to Jerusalem's temple would draw his people's loyalty back to Judah. To prevent this, he established alternative shrines, golden calves at Bethel and Dan, echoing the wilderness idol of Moses' time. To some, this was innovation, to others, betrayal. The bond of faith that once united the tribes now fractured into rivalry and suspicion. What followed was a tale of brothers turned enemies. Armies clashed across borders. Judah and Israel fought not as kin, but as rivals. Prophets thundered warnings of judgment, voices crying in marketplaces and palace courts, declaring that a divided people could not stand for long. And yet, life went on. Farmers plowed the valleys of Jezreel, fishermen cast nets into the Sea of Galilee, merchants carried spices along caravan routes. But always, the shadow of war hung above. The dream of a single united Israel had ended almost as soon as it had begun. For 2 centuries, the twin kingdoms walked separate paths. Israel grew wealthy from trade, its northern fields blooming with grain, its markets bustling with Aramean goods. But its politics were turbulent, dynasties rose and fell in violent coups, kings murdered, thrones seized in bloody succession. Judah, meanwhile, endured quietly. Smaller, more conservative, its rulers clung to the promise that the line of David would not be broken. Yet beneath the surface, both shared the same fate, vulnerability. Assyria to the northeast was rising, a juggernaut of iron armies and ruthless ambition. From Nineveh and Ashur, kings with names like Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser were forging an empire that swallowed nations whole. For Israel and Judah, divided and distrustful, the storm clouds of conquest were gathering. The land once united under David was now a fractured house, its walls crumbling from within, its enemies pressing from without. And the ancient covenant, the very bond that had once defined them, grew thin, frayed, almost forgotten. In Jerusalem, the priests clung to the rituals of Solomon's temple. In Samaria, kings built palaces, adorned with ivory and cedar, symbols of worldly power. But behind the grandeur, the seeds of destruction lay sown. The brothers had divided. And when brothers divide, others will conquer. From the distant plains of Mesopotamia, Assyria stirred. Its armies moved like locusts, devouring cities, toppling kings. For the northern kingdom of Israel, the storm was about to break, and with it, the fate of 10 tribes would be sealed forever. The northern hills of Israel once rang with harvest songs, with children running between olive groves and shepherds calling across the fields. But by the 8th century BCE, those songs were drowned out by the tramp of foreign armies. From beyond the Euphrates, a storm was gathering, the Assyrians, masters of iron and terror, whose banners carried the weight of empire. Assyria was unlike any power the Levant had yet faced. Its kings ruled through fear as much as force. Cities that resisted were razed, their inhabitants impaled or dragged into chains. Armies moved with ruthless precision, chariots thundering across plains, archers in disciplined ranks, siege engines pounding against walls. Where Assyria marched, independence withered. Israel, divided by palace intrigues and shifting alliances, stood vulnerable. The prophets Amos, Hosea, Isaiah had long warned that corruption and idolatry would invite destruction. In marketplaces and temple courtyards, they cried, "Because you have turned from the covenant, the Lord will send a nation against you." Few listened. The first blow fell under Tiglath-Pileser III. His armies swept into Galilee, seizing towns, deporting thousands. Families were torn from ancestral homes, driven east into lands they had never seen. Israel's strength began to crumble. Then came the final storm. In 722 BCE, Shalmaneser V, and soon after, Sargon II, laid siege to Samaria, Israel's proud capital. For 3 years, the city held out. Its walls stood battered but unbroken, its people clinging to hope as famine gnawed and fear whispered through the streets. Smoke curled above houses as defenders braced for each assault. But Assyria was relentless. When the gates finally fell, Samaria was crushed. Its leaders were executed, its treasures plundered, its survivors shackled and marched away. The kingdom of Israel, once 10 proud tribes, ceased to exist. Deportation was not random cruelty, it was strategy. The Assyrians uprooted entire populations, scattering them across the vast empire to prevent rebellion. The Israelites were dispersed into Media, Assyria, and lands along the Habor River. In their place, foreign settlers were brought to Samaria, people from Babylon, Cutha, and Hamath, reshaping the land's identity. Thus began the Great Silence. 10 tribes, carried away into exile, swallowed by foreign soil. Their names remained Reuben, Simeon, Naphtali, Issachar, and the rest, but their voices faded. Never again would they gather as one people in their ancestral hills. Judah to the south still stood, a lone remnant of David's throne, watching as its northern kin vanished. Prophets wept. In Jerusalem, songs of lament rose. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Yet even those laments could not bridge the chasm of loss. To the Assyrians, it was conquest. To Israel, it was catastrophe. Families broken, traditions diluted, faith tested in foreign lands. And in the centuries that followed, the fate of the 10 tribes became not just history, but mystery. Where had they gone? Did they vanish into the dust of exile, or did they endure, hidden in distant nations, waiting for a day of return? The Assyrian conquest was more than the fall of a kingdom. It was the beginning of an enigma that would echo through millennia, a disappearance that gave rise to legend, to prophecy, to the haunting title, The Lost Tribes of Israel. Chains rattled across the Euphrates as thousands vanished into exile. Their voices dimmed, their names blurred, their memories scattered. But the story did not end with conquest. Beyond the deserts, whispers of the tribes would surface, in distant lands, in unexpected places, carried like seeds by the winds of history. The dust of Samaria's fall had not yet settled when the long march began. Across stony valleys and barren deserts, columns of captives trudged under the lash of Assyrian overseers. Men, women, children, the remnants of Israel's northern tribes, were bound together in chains of bronze, their footsteps marking the path of exile. The Euphrates River shimmered ahead, vast and unyielding, a boundary between the world they had known and the unknown lands that awaited. Crossing it was more than geography, it was the crossing of identity itself. Behind them lay the hills of Ephraim, the vineyards of Galilee, the sanctuaries of Bethel and Dan. Before them stretched the endless heartlands of Assyria, alien soil where their language, their customs, even their God, would be tested. Assyrian records describe this policy with chilling simplicity. Conquered peoples were scattered. Whole tribes were uprooted and resettled far from their homeland, their places filled with foreigners who owed loyalty to Nineveh. It was a strategy of erasure, dissolving nations into the vast machinery of empire. Israel's 10 tribes became one thread among thousands woven into Assyria's dominion. Some were sent to the lands of Media, near the Zagros Mountains, where snow-fed rivers carve valleys of iron and stone. Others were placed in the cities along the Habor River, in what is now northern Syria. Generations of Israelites lived in those foreign landscapes, their songs mingling with strange tongues, their traditions bending beneath foreign gods. The prophets had foretold this exile with brutal clarity. Hosea had warned of a people swallowed among the nations. Amos had cried that Israel would be led beyond Damascus. Now those words were reality, etched not in parchment but in the weary faces of families forced from their land. Yet exile was not merely punishment. For Assyria, it was practicality, a way to break resistance and populate distant frontiers. The Israelites became farmers on foreign soil, laborers in strange cities, soldiers drafted into Assyrian campaigns. Their children learned to speak new languages. Their grandchildren might no longer remember the hills of Samaria. And still, something endured. In their prayers whispered at night, in their festivals kept in secret, in the stories retold around hearths, the memory of Zion flickered. Even far from Jerusalem, they spoke of a God who was not bound to stone or territory, but who walked with his people through wilderness and exile alike. For Judah to the south, watching from Jerusalem, this was a warning carved in history. They alone remained, a fragile kingdom under the shadow of empires. The sight of Israel's ruin and dispersal hung over them like a prophecy of doom. As years passed, the northern tribes began to fade from record. Assyrian scribes listed their deportations. Babylonian and Persian chronicles later made brief mention of them. But then, silence. No return, no restoration, no homecoming procession. 10 tribes, carried beyond the Euphrates, slipped into the mists of history. And so the mystery was born. Did they vanish into assimilation, their identity dissolved? Or did they survive, hidden among distant peoples, carrying their covenant across borders and centuries? Chains had dragged them from their homeland, but chains could not erase their story. That story became a ghost, a haunting absence that would stir rabbis, travelers, conquerors, and dreamers for generations. The Euphrates had swallowed the tribes, scattering them into silence. But silence breeds whispers, and whispers become legends. Across deserts, mountains, and rivers, echoes of the lost tribes would begin to surface, faint, fragile, yet impossible to ignore. The Assyrian tablets tell us where the exiles were sent: Habor, Media, distant towns along imperial roads. But beyond those records lies only silence. It is as if the 10 tribes were swallowed by the desert winds, their voices scattered into the emptiness. For the Israelites themselves, exile was more than displacement. It was disorientation. The land of promise, the hills, the harvests, the sacred sanctuaries, was gone. Each dawn brought not the call of familiar shepherds, but the sounds of foreign markets and pagan rituals. Each night, the stars above seemed colder, as though even heaven had turned its face away. What happens when a people loses its center? Some clung to the fragments of their faith, whispering prayers in hidden corners, teaching children stories of Abraham and Jacob. Others, beaten by despair, melted into the fabric of empire, marrying into foreign tribes, speaking new tongues, serving new kings. Generation by generation, the memory of Israel thinned. Prophets lamented, yet also spoke of hope, that the scattered children of Israel would one day be gathered again, as sheep brought back to a single fold. But for the world watching, it seemed they had simply disappeared. Travelers moving through Assyrian land centuries later spoke of communities with Hebrew echoes, customs half-remembered, festivals oddly familiar. Were these remnants of the tribes, or only shadows mistaken for them? The truth blurred. Their identity dissolved like ink in water, impossible to separate, yet never fully erased. This was the birth of the enigma. No battle records explain their fate. No triumphant homecoming was ever chronicled. Instead, history holds a gap, a silence that invited speculation. Some said they journeyed farther east, beyond the Zagros Mountains. Others believed they wandered south, into the deserts of Arabia. Still others thought they sailed across seas, carried by winds to lands unknown. The exile became more than tragedy, it became a mystery, one that would ripple across centuries. A disappearance that would inspire legends, fuel myths, and leave behind a haunting question: where did they go? The Assyrian conquest had taken their land. Time itself now seemed to erase their name. The 10 tribes faded not in one moment, but like sand scattered grain by grain, until the desert winds carried them into legend. From silence rose speculation. Across distant lands, echoes of the lost tribes began to surface, in stories told by merchants, in customs observed by strangers, in legends carried far from the hills of. Across the shifting map of the ancient Near East, the voice of the lost tribes did not vanish entirely. It lingered like an echo, faint, uncertain, but persistent, in the chronicles of empires, in the reports of travelers, and in the whispers of foreign peoples who seemed to bear unfamiliar yet familiar traits. In the lands of Media and Persia, scattered communities began to appear whose customs bore striking resemblances to Israelite traditions. They refrained from eating certain foods, they marked their calendars in unusual ways, and they carried stories of a god who was not bound to idols of stone. To Assyrian officials, these were just conquered peoples, folded into the empire's vast tapestry. But to later eyes, they seemed fragments of a people refusing to vanish. The Book of Tobit, written during the exile, offers a glimpse into this reality. It tells of Israelites living in Nineveh, holding to their faith quietly amid foreign streets, burying their dead with dignity, and refusing to surrender completely to the culture around them. It is a rare window into the soul of the displaced, evidence that even far from home, identities smoldered like an ember. Legends spread. Some claimed that beyond the Euphrates lay a hidden multitude of Israelites, preserved as a body of tribes awaiting the appointed time of return. Jewish tradition later spoke of the river Sambation, a roaring, impassable torrent that flowed all week except on the Sabbath, behind which the tribes had been hidden by divine hand. The myth was not history, but it was memory reshaped into hope, a way to imagine survival when facts had disappeared. Foreign observers, too, left hints. Greek historians, wandering through Persian lands, encountered groups who worshipped differently, spoke in strange tongues, and practiced customs alien to their neighbors. Were these remnants of the 10 tribes, or merely coincidences born of cultural exchange? The ancient record leaves only tantalizing fragments. As empires shifted, so too did the whispers. With the fall of Assyria and the rise of Babylon, some believe the exiled Israelites moved farther east, carried with deported peoples into Central Asia. Others suggested their bloodlines mingled among Scythian nomads, fierce riders who roamed the steppes north of the Black Sea. In their mobility, their warrior spirit, and their sudden eruptions into history, some later writers saw reflections of the tribes of Israel, transformed but not extinguished. The silence of the 10 tribes became fertile ground for imagination. Rabbis pondered it in their commentaries. Merchants repeated tales of Jewish-like peoples encountered along the edges of the known world. Each sighting was more than curiosity, it was a lifeline, proof that the covenant people might still endure, even if hidden in shadows. For Judah, still standing in Jerusalem until Babylon's conquest in 586 BCE, the fate of the northern tribes was both warning and wound. The prophets of Judah invoked their loss again and again, a reminder that disobedience led to dispersion, that forgetting the covenant invited erasure. The lost tribes became not just history, but symbol, a cautionary tale carved into national memory. And yet, as centuries passed, the echoes grew fainter. Assimilation worked silently, eroding distinctions generation by generation. A child born in Media might know nothing of Samaria. A soldier pressed into Assyrian service might fight and die for a king who spoke a language his ancestors could not understand. But in scattered corners, fragments persisted, a song, a law, a memory whispered like a prayer. This is how a people disappears without dying. Not in a single battle, not in a single exile, but in the slow erosion of identity until what remains are echoes, faint, elusive, yet enduring enough to stir questions in every age. From Media to Mesopotamia, from steppes to deserts, the echoes of the lost tribes rippled outward, carried by rumor and memory. Soon, the search for their descendants would stretch farther still, across caravan roads and mountain passes, into lands where the Silk Road stitched together civilizations. Caravans creaked across the ancient highways of Asia, their camels swaying under loads of silk, spices, and precious stones. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the oases of Central Asia, from Persia's royal roads to the passes of the Himalayas, the Silk Road was more than trade. It was a river of cultures, carrying languages, ideas, and faiths across continents. Along this vast network, whispers of the lost tribes began to reappear, faint but persistent, woven into the fabric of the world's greatest crossroads. Some believed that as Assyrian and Babylonian empires scattered them, the exiled Israelites traveled eastward, swept along the currents of migration. In Bactria and Parthia, beyond the Oxus River, travelers recorded communities whose customs seemed strangely familiar. They spoke of rites that echoed Mosaic law, of dietary rules that mirrored Hebrew tradition, of ancient tales resembling those of Israel. Were these remnants of the tribes, or coincidences born of cultural contact? The line blurred, leaving only tantalizing hints. By the time of the Persian Empire, Jewish communities dotted the eastern frontier. Esther's story in the royal court of Susa reflected not only the survival of Judah's exiles but also the deeper truth: scattered Israelites had found niches in foreign lands, adapting yet enduring. Some of these communities became bridges between East and West, merchants and scribes traveling where armies could not. Legends multiplied. Ancient chroniclers wrote of tribes carried beyond the Caspian gates, the narrow passes of the Caucasus that opened toward the steppes. Others claimed they roamed with nomadic peoples, the Scythians, fierce horsemen of the plains. Greek writers noted tribes along the Black Sea whose customs seemed alien, whose origins were mysterious. Later generations looked back and wondered, could these have been Israelites, transformed by centuries of exile into riders of the steppe? The Silk Road was not a single road but a web, and across its threads the mystery spread. Merchants traveling from Antioch to Samarkand returned with stories of Jewish-like groups in faraway lands. Buddhist monks passing westward from India met communities whose festivals bore uncanny parallels to the Passover. Even in China's chronicles, vague references to Western tribes with unusual laws were recorded, shadows, perhaps, of the scattered sons of Israel. For the rabbis and scholars of later centuries, these rumors were more than curiosity. They were hope. The covenant promised that Israel would not be destroyed, only dispersed. Thus, every tale of a distant tribe became a possible key to prophecy, a sign that the lost ones endured, waiting for a day of ingathering. And yet, for all the legends, certainty remained elusive. The Silk Road blurred identities as much as it revealed them. Cultures intermingled, religions overlapped, languages blended. A festival that looked mosaic in one oasis might simply be coincidence in another. A dietary law that resembled Hebrew tradition might arise from entirely different roots. The truth lay hidden beneath centuries of mingling, like threads lost in a tapestry too vast to unravel. Still, the idea persisted that somewhere beyond the mountains and deserts, beyond the reach of empires, the 10 tribes continued, not vanished but scattered, their blood flowing quietly through the veins of nations across Asia. As the Silk Road carried silk to Rome and glass to China, it also carried the legend of a people lost yet not forgotten. The desert winds that once swallowed their voices had now carried them eastward, embedding their memory in the great exchange of civilizations. The caravans moved on, carrying both goods and stories. And as they traveled farther, the echoes of the lost tribes did not fade, they multiplied. In the farthest corners of the known world, from the African highlands to the kingdoms of India, new legends began to emerge, each claiming to hold the missing sons of Israel. From the edges of Africa to the valleys of India, from the highlands of Central Asia to the islands beyond Arabia, stories of the lost tribes seemed to surface like fragments of a shattered mirror. Each shard reflected something of Israel, though never the whole: customs resembling ancient law, songs that echoed Hebrew cadences, faces and traditions that stirred recognition in wandering scholars. Whether legend or truth, these tales gave shape to one of history's greatest mysteries. In the highlands of Ethiopia, ancient chronicles told of a people who claimed descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Beta Israel, later known as Ethiopian Jews, preserved customs of Sabbath, dietary laws, and scripture. Were they remnants of Judah's survival, or echoes of Israel's vanished tribes carried into Africa through trade and migration? Their story became one of the most enduring legends, a bridge between biblical memory and African heritage. Farther east, in the lush valleys of India, communities such as the Bene Israel and the Cochin Jews kept traditions that startled explorers. They spoke of ancestors arriving by sea, cast ashore from shipwrecks long ago. Their rituals bore marks of both ancient Israelite law and local Indian influence, a fusion of survival across centuries. Some saw in them the lost tribes who had wandered not by land but by ocean, carried by winds into the heart of South Asia. On the steppes of Central Asia, travelers whispered of tribes beyond the Oxus who followed strange prohibitions, avoided certain foods, and marked their dead in unfamiliar ways. In Afghanistan, the Pashtun people preserve oral traditions linking themselves to Israelite ancestors. Though scholars debated the authenticity, the persistence of the claim revealed how deeply the legend of the lost tribes had traveled, embedding itself in the very identity of distant nations. The Caucasus, too, became a theater of speculation. The fierce Khazars, who in later centuries converted to Judaism, were said by some to be heirs of the tribes, their rulers invoking Israelite lineage to sanctify their power. Armenian and Georgian chronicles spoke of Israelites dwelling among their mountains, remnants of an exile no empire could fully erase. Even in China, traces appeared. The Kaifeng Jews, discovered by Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century, preserved Torah scrolls and synagogues deep in the Middle Kingdom. Their origins stretched back to merchants on the Silk Road, but some wondered if their roots were older still, perhaps descendants of the vanished tribes who had journeyed farther east than any had imagined. What tied all these legends together was not certainty but longing. For Jewish communities scattered after later exiles, in Babylon, in Rome, in Spain, the fate of their northern brothers remained a wound. To hear of Israelites surviving in Africa, in Asia, or at the edge of the known world was to believe that the covenant still lived, that no tribe was truly erased. Medieval travelers carried the flame of these stories further. Benjamin of Tudela, the great Jewish explorer of the 12th century, wrote of lost tribes dwelling in distant Persia, Arabia, and beyond the river Sambation, a mythical torrent said to guard their lands. His accounts blurred fact and wonder, but they kept alive the vision of a people not lost but hidden. Christian Europe, too, became fascinated. Crusaders and scholars speculated that if the tribes still existed, they might rise at the end of days to aid in apocalyptic battles. Maps and manuscripts marked distant corners with notes of Israelites beyond this land. The legend became not only a Jewish hope but a Christian obsession, folded into prophecies of the Second Coming. In Islamic tradition, echoes also survived. Quranic commentaries spoke of the scattering of the Israelites and their destiny among the nations. Muslim historians, traveling across Asia and Africa, sometimes encountered communities they linked to the tribes, their presence woven into the broader story of exile and divine will. The lost tribes had thus become more than history. They were myth, prophecy, symbol. They lived not only in faraway valleys and deserts, but in the imagination of civilizations. Every nation seemed to hold a piece of them: Ethiopia, India, Afghanistan, China, the Caucasus. Each claim was both proof and illusion, fragments of a mystery that deepened the farther one looked. And yet, behind the legends lay something real. Across continents, scattered Jewish communities had endured, adapting, blending, surviving. Whether or not they were the 10 tribes, their very existence testified to the resilience of a people who could be dispersed but not erased. By the medieval era, the tribes were no longer simply a question of history, they had become a global riddle. Rabbis, priests, and explorers sought them not only for curiosity but for destiny. For if the tribes still lived, their return might mark the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, the gathering of all Israel, the restoration of a broken whole. Legends in distant kingdoms kept the mystery alive, but they were still only whispers, scattered and uncertain. In time, seekers would rise, scholars, travelers, and dreamers, who set out deliberately to chase the echoes and uncover the fate of the tribes. The search itself would become part of the story. Across the medieval and early modern world, whispers of the lost tribes were no longer enough. The age of seekers had dawned, men who did not simply repeat legends but set their feet upon roads, rivers, and seas to chase the truth. It began with travelers like Benjamin of Tudela, a Jewish explorer from 12th century Spain. With parchment in his satchel and courage in his step, he journeyed across the Mediterranean, through Mesopotamia, Persia, and even into the shadow of India. His writings spoke of Jewish communities scattered like starlight across the world. Some were remnants of exile, others, he hinted, could be fragments of the 10 tribes. His words carried the weight of both discovery and hope, sparking imaginations across Europe and the Middle East. But the search was not only Jewish. In Christian Europe, the mystery of the lost tribes became entangled with prophecy. Medieval monks pored over maps, marking rivers and mountains where the tribes might dwell. They spoke of the river Sambation, a torrent of stone and fire said to rage 6 days a week and rest only on the Sabbath, sealing the tribes from the outside world. For Christians, their reappearance was often tied to apocalyptic visions, a final gathering of God's people before the end of days. As the Crusades raged, rumors of hidden Israelites fighting in distant lands electrified knights and kings. Chroniclers describe tribes of fierce warriors beyond Persia, said to be descendants of Israel, waiting for the moment to march west and reclaim their inheritance. Though such tales were more dream than fact, they fueled a sense that the world still held uncharted mysteries. By the Renaissance, exploration had broadened the horizon. The discovery of the New World added new layers to the question. Some European theologians wondered if Native American peoples could be descendants of the lost tribes, carried across oceans in forgotten ages. The theory, though flawed, revealed how deeply the mystery had become part of global imagination. No corner of the earth seemed beyond suspicion. In the 16th century, Antonio de Montesinos, a Portuguese traveler, journeyed deep into South America. In the jungles of Ecuador, he claimed to have encountered natives who spoke of ancient laws, rituals, and a memory of Israel. His testimony ignited debate across Europe. Could the Andes themselves shelter remnants of the tribes? Those scholars doubted. Missionaries and settlers carried the story into the colonial age, where it blended with politics, prophecy, and empire. At the same time, Jewish messianic movements leaned heavily upon the hope of the tribe's survival. Figures like Manasseh ben Israel, a rabbi of Amsterdam in the 17th century, argued passionately that the discovery of Jewish remnants across the globe proved prophecy was nearing fulfillment. He petitioned rulers, including Oliver Cromwell, to readmit Jews to England, linking the return of the tribes with the dawn of redemption. For him, the search was not academic curiosity but a sign of history's turning point. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, scholars and travelers also recorded encounters with communities tied, rightly or wrongly, to Israel's past. In the mountains of Yemen, Jewish groups clung to traditions that seemed ancient, leading some to speculate about connections to the tribes of the north. In Persia and Afghanistan, tales persisted of tribes with Israelite ancestry, blurring the line between fact and folklore. The Age of Enlightenment did not dim the pursuit. Instead, it reframed it. European scholars, with growing tools of anthropology and history, began to investigate systematically. The question of the lost tribes moved from prophecy into ethnography, from sermons into scientific journals. Yet even under the gaze of reason, the allure remained. Expeditions were funded, missionaries dispatched, reports compiled. Each time a remote community was discovered, from the Pashtun of Afghanistan to the Jews of Kaifeng in China, speculation returned. Were these the missing sons of Israel? The 19th century, with its colonial reach, added urgency. British officers in India collected tales of the Bene Israel. Russian explorers in the Caucasus examined mountain tribes for biblical links. In Africa, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia drew fascination, their customs stirring debates about whether they were guardians of ancient Israelite practice. Every discovery was like a flare in the darkness, illuminating possibilities but never resolving the question. And yet, the search itself was transformative. For Jewish communities across the diaspora, hearing of these far-flung groups was a reminder that they were not alone. That somewhere, perhaps, their kin survived, hidden but faithful. For Christians and Muslims, the tribes represented both a riddle and a promise, entwined with visions of destiny. The seekers, rabbis, priests, scholars, adventurers, rarely found what they hoped for. But in their journeys, they stitched together a world more connected than any had imagined. Caravans across Asia, ships across oceans, letters between distant synagogues, all became threads in a global tapestry of identity and memory. By the dawn of the modern era, the tribes had become less a physical people to be found and more a symbol. They embodied exile and hope, loss and endurance. To search for them was to search for meaning in dispersion, to believe that history, however cruel, had not written its final line. The search had crossed continents and centuries, igniting faith and curiosity alike. Yet with every supposed discovery came more uncertainty. What remained was not clarity but a haunting truth. Perhaps the mystery of the lost tribes was destined never to be solved. Night falls on the story of the lost tribes much as it began, with shadows and silence. Empires have risen and fallen, oceans have been crossed, libraries filled with speculation, yet the mystery endures. Across deserts and mountains, through forests and plains, no one has ever stood and declared with certainty, "Here they are." And so the 10 tribes remain suspended in history, neither fully gone nor fully found, their absence echoing louder than their presence ever could. In modern times, the search has not ceased. It has only shifted shape. Where once explorers set out with maps and caravans, today scientists probe with DNA. Genetics traces the migrations of peoples, uncovering hidden kinships and forgotten ties. Yet even here, the results raise as many questions as they answer. Some studies suggest faint links between scattered groups, Pashtun tribes, Lemba clans of southern Africa, and communities in India, to ancient Israel. But science, like legend, cannot settle the matter. The fragments never resolve into a single whole. Meanwhile, the story lives on in identity. For the Pashtun of Afghanistan, some traditions claim descent from Israel's tribes, linking warrior codes to biblical ancestry. For the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, centuries of isolation did not erase a deep conviction of connection to the covenant. In India's Konkan coast, the Bene Israel kept fragments of Hebrew prayers alive across 2,000 years. Each of these communities embodies survival, whether of memory, myth, or bloodline. And beyond these are echoes, quieter still, customs, proverbs, rituals that resemble Israelite tradition without explanation. Are they remnants of lost sons, or coincidences of culture? No historian can answer with certainty. But the persistence of these traces shows something remarkable, that the tribes, even if scattered into oblivion, never truly disappeared. They lived on in story, in imagination, in faith. For Jews across centuries, the lost tribes were more than history. They were hope. The prophets had spoken of a final return, of a great ingathering from the corners of the earth. To believe in the tribes was to believe in a future where exile was not the last word. For Christians, too, the tribes carry apocalyptic weight, tied to visions of revelation and redemption. For Muslims, they remained figures in eschatological lore, part of the divine plan yet to unfold. In each faith, the mystery of the tribes became a canvas on which to paint destiny. But perhaps the true legacy lies not in what was found, but in what was sought. The lost tribes remind us of how deeply humans resist the idea of disappearance. We cannot accept that whole peoples simply vanish. Instead, we weave stories to keep them alive, scattering them into legends and distant lands. In doing so, we keep them close, not in fact, perhaps, but in imagination. Even today, the question stirs curiosity. Are the tribes hidden still, tucked away in some remote valley? Or have they been here all along, their blood mingled into the nations, their identity dissolved into the great tide of history? Scholars debate, believers wonder, storytellers dream. And still the silence remains. The lost tribes stand as a mirror of humanity itself, our migrations, our exiles, our resilience. They are a story of survival against the odds, but also of how history can fracture, scattering pieces so widely they may never be reassembled. In them, we glimpse both the fragility of memory and its astonishing endurance. The Assyrian conquerors who marched Israel into captivity never imagined their act would echo across millennia. To them, it was a campaign, a tally of prisoners, another line carved into imperial stone. Yet from that moment of conquest was born one of history's greatest mysteries, a tale that outlived the empire itself. Assyria crumbled into dust, but the tribes it scattered became immortal in absence. As the centuries turn, the story is unlikely to end. Each generation rediscovers it, reshaping the legend to fit its own questions and hopes. The tribes are searched for in deserts, in mountains, in bloodlines, in archives, in genes. Perhaps they will never be found. Perhaps that is the point. For as long as they are lost, they will always be with us. And so, the curtain falls not with an answer, but with an echo, the sound of a people who walked into exile and disappeared into history's horizon. Their footsteps still linger in the sands of Mesopotamia, in the mountain winds of Persia, in the whisper of caravans along the Silk Road. Theirs is a silence that refuses to fade, a silence that has outlasted empires. The story of the lost tribes is not a closed book but an open question, carried forward by every age. Their fate remains unwritten, their memory undying. And in that mystery lies their true power, not in being found, but in never being forgotten.